Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to INSS. I'm Itai Brun, Deputy Director of INSS, and we are marking 100 days for the Biden administration. President George Biden, the 46th President of the United States, inaugurated on January 26 on Capitol Hill, the building that was stormed 2 weeks before the supporters of Trump. In the inauguration, he promised he will be a president of all Americans. In one of the first speeches he gave, he said, "America is back, diplomacy is back." Seems like a wish to bring back the Democrat liberal agenda and America's leadership in this world order. In the meantime, he called Putin a murderer. He imposed sanctions on Russia because of a cyber attack, the SolarWind incident. He said the president of China doesn't have a democratic bone in his body, hosted the prime minister of Japan as what looks like a message to the Chinese. Americans are speaking indirectly with Iranians on the Iran deal. Sanctions on the Houthis in Yemen were canceled. And the ICC, also a report by American intelligence about the Saudi involvement in the murder of Khashoggi. But it's pretty clear that in Biden's agenda, internal affairs are before foreign affairs. So we will begin with you, Yuna Leibson, the Channel 12 correspondent in the United States. Maybe we'll begin with two issues. One, the issue of the presidential approval rating, the trust of the American people. Tens of millions of people believed maybe that the elections were stolen from them. The first question is, how can Biden, or can he, bring back America's trust in the democratic process? Second, the economy. Biden looks like someone that is charging the economy. He has a program to increase governmental involvement, to bring more taxes on the high net worth companies, to regulate companies that contribute to damaging the environment. What is the policy in internal affairs, and in this, the financial issue? Okay, so first, thank you very much for inviting me. As you said, we're exactly 3 months since the inauguration, and I think that maybe the thing that most characterizes, especially when we're talking about internal affairs, that is the central issue that Biden is dealing with. You spoke about several steps in foreign affairs, and others will speak about it, but I think that first, so much has been done during these 100 days that, it seems like there are, I think, many issues in foreign affairs, but we'll see the internal affairs that is much more. I think that if we would tell someone, even back in the primaries, that the next president of the United States, these are the things he's going to do in internal affairs, I don't know if people would believe it, that Joe Biden is the president that's going to do such measures. More than that, I don't know how many critics of Joe Biden on both sides, on the Democratic side and the Republican Party, would guess that this is what it would look like. It's very surprising, very active, striving to change the policy issues that he's taking. It's very different, I think, from the way he was portrayed, at least his opponents, internally and externally, throughout his campaign. And I think even Joe Biden himself, when we look at what he did, the way he implemented it, and the things he did throughout his career, it's surprising because we knew Joe Biden of external foreign affairs as a senator or a vice president. Those were the issues that he dealt with, and suddenly now he's dealing more with internal affairs. So the issue of public support is very different, very difficult. It's not something that you can have a magic plan. And I want to start with focusing on the first 4 issues that Biden said he's going to deal with in the first 100 days. These are the issues that are important for him. And this is what he's putting on central stage in his actions, publicly, but also practically. And that's first and foremost everything that has to do with the COVID pandemic, health-wise at least. When Biden came into office, there were vaccines, between tens to hundreds, thousands a day. Now we're talking about 3.5 million a day. The United States passed 200 million. His goal was 100 million in his first 100 days. Half of the adult population in the United States above the age of 18 already got at least the first vaccine. And if you know the United States and you know how it looks there, and their dispersed system, and how everything is not aligned And there's the private sector and the public sector and so many actors that all have to be connected. And the size, you understand the greatness of the achievement in this huge country. With all due respect to Israeli operation, that's very impressive. What's happening in the United States is much more complex to perform. Of course, there's the financial issue that we'll reach in a minute. This is the second goal, financial issues. In principle, things that were always true in the United States, but certainly in the time after the coronavirus pandemic. And I'll also say that unlike Israel, in the past we used to do it, but not now, but identifying the crisis as an opportunity, Biden is doing things that if we did not have the COVID pandemic, there was no chance he could do. The support that he has in the public, the understanding that he can do things, and we'll talk about it. For instance, grants for children, something the United States is a substantial change. It would never pass if there was no crisis. So this will be talked by historians, how much the COVID pandemic was an opportunity for Joe Biden and how much it even helped him to be elected. The third issue is racial inequality. A central issue was always throughout the history of the United States, certainly what we see these days. We are right now before the sentencing in Derek Chauvin's trial, the police officer that murdered George Floyd. Forces are going to Minneapolis. That's where the trial is taking place. It's now being passed to the jury. And the interesting thing here is to see that, we see this long ago that we had with this Trump, before that with Obama. We know this for decades, this tension and how much Biden wants to go to reconciliation. It's still there and it's not going to be easy. And part of the financial program, by the way, his big infrastructure program deals also with these issues. There's a connection between the issues. And we see this in everything that has to do with the pandemic. We know this throughout history. When there is a financial crisis, and these are things that repeat themselves. So one, the weak segments of society are hurt more. They're hurt twice. First, because they are weak, and as far as their jobs and their status. And second is the health issue. African Americans, Hispanics died more. They were more hurt. They were more sick in proportion to their size in the society. And we see an increase in racism and hate crimes after every crisis. We see this, things that already changed during this COVID pandemic. It will take time to change the way it's perceived in the public. And of course, the crime against Asians in the United States, especially after the words of President Trump about this virus being the Chinese pandemic, Chinese virus. And the fourth issue is the climate issue, the climate crisis. It's the only thing that has to do with foreign affairs, but it has to do with the four core issues that he's dealing. Environment is not easy, even for the Democratic Party. Certainly people from the center like Joe Biden, many voters that come from areas that also they are in the central of the industry. When it's mentioned, the issue of the environment, there are congressmen and senators that are irritated or are uneasy with this, and you know what I mean, because for them, it's jobs, it's life. There's a separation. There's livelihood. You can be Democrat as far as your ideas, but when you have jobs and industries that is based on energy, it's problematic. I'll end by saying, and I'll relate to economy, I just want to say that when Joe Biden was elected, there was a joke I had with my editor. I told him, so now my job is going to be canceled? That's it. No Trump. Let's news. And by the way, the data for all media in the world shows that there's a reduction in consumption of news since Trump left office. Even if we would put COVID pandemic aside, because people were more interested in what's going on, still we see a decrease. We see the effect. So no, I'm still here, but it's much more normal, regular, much more organized, structured. But still, it's not boring because revolutions are happening here, unprecedented. And I'll end with saying, and you said it, actions in the economy that are much more from the progressive side of the Democratic Party, even Biden, the New Deal, as they say. And it's not only that, it started with his first rescue plan, of course, to continue with the benefits for the unemployed, sending checks to people, benefits for businesses, the grants for children. Again, this is a game changer. Only this could have had the media speaking for weeks. and it went under the radar. We're talking, of course, about a huge program for jobs, for infrastructure, for building roads and bridges, rehabilitation of old neighborhoods, dealing with what we mentioned of the inequality, because it's more in these neighborhoods. And Biden is not afraid to take the corporates head on, to raise the taxes, deal with the tech giants, something that other administrations did not do. Another thing that has nothing to do with the economy, well, we see that now, mass shootings, guns, a very problematic issue in the United States, controversial. Biden wants to deal with it. He wants to do legislation. And one thing I think we see different from the Obama era, if we compare, it's the understanding that he won't have another opportunity to do all these financial changes, so he has to jump on everything at once. And the second thing is that these things have to be PR'd. You have to take credit for it, go from city to city and talk about it as much as possible. Again, so the public won't forget who the president that did all the changes. Answer to a big question, so I understand from you, that certainly not Sleepy Joe Biden, as he was called by President Trump. So I understand from you that he's going to be an American president that does breakthroughs. It's not another version of Obama, it's someone else with a totally different line. He has his agenda because he has a challenge that he didn't have in the past. Will he be remembered in decades from now as someone that did the revolution? Interesting question. We have to see how it plays out. We'll see what the future brings. Will all countries make a dramatic change? But right now, the test of the 100 days, certainly huge chips. And the will and the courage to make these changes in the overall political setup. Unfortunately, but you know, presidents are judged at the end of their term, so not in the beginning. Thank you very much. And from here to external affairs, Dan Shapiro, former ambassador to Israel, today a distinguished visiting fellow at INSS. Dan, this activity also reflects to external affairs. How do you see his policies towards China and Russia, and in general, is the United States going back to a position of leading in the international community? Thank you, Itai. Biden is an old-timer in politics. Throughout his career, during the Cold War, and then fighting terror. So all of this vast experience, he believes in traditional tools of force and power of the United States, but he also recognizes the fact that the challenges of the 21st century are not the same challenges of the past. So I would define the approach of Biden as an attempt, yes, an attempt to strengthen the traditional tools of American power, but to use those tools towards the challenges of the new age. So what are the challenges of the new age? First and foremost, these are challenges and problems that are not in the confinement of one country. What are we talking about? COVID pandemic and future pandemics that we must prepare for. Change in the climate, global warming, or we could talk about a climate crisis that is endangering all of us, all the planet Earth. Immigration, waves of people that are passing between countries during wartime and moving from country to country, non-proliferation of advanced weaponry, and the challenge, the struggle between democratic states and autocratic countries. Biden believes that in order to deal with these challenges, he needs to have American leadership, for the United States to return to a role of leader. If the United States is not in the lead in such crises, there are two possibilities: or chaos, or that one of its rivals will lead in ways that will oppose American interests. So if you talked about leading is this Obama's leading from behind or a different kind of leadership? No. The key here to deal with these challenges is leadership in international organizations and international initiatives. We saw in the first days of it when he was in office that he joined the Paris Accord. He joined the World Health Organization. He's trying to rejoin the Iran deal. He's trying to reduce tension with the United Nations. Within his first 100 days, we see American initiatives to bring vaccinations to poor countries, to improve preparedness for future pandemics, to convince countries to do more, to do beyond their commitments of the Paris Accord, working towards improving the situation of the climate and the issue of democracies or the fight against theocracies. Second, the Biden administration sees that in the near future, the main challenge or strategic challenge will be the struggle between the powers, the rise of China, the return of Russia to an aggressive position, a very aggressive approach. China is a more clear situation because it relates to financial security, military, technology and others. And China, throughout the 21st century, will be much more stronger than Russia. But both are challenging at the moment. So what are the tools that Biden wants to use to cope with these challenges? First, to renew alliances. United States alliances with NATO and in Asia. We saw this in the early visits of Blinken, Secretary of State, and Secretary Austin to Korea, Japan, NATO. The first visit that Biden hosted was the Japanese Prime Minister. He already had a Zoom conference with NATO leaders, and we also see this in appointments, nominations, that the first priority of Biden is that the partners of the United States will feel of the commitment, the renewed commitment of the United States, and strengthen their commitments towards the United States. Second is to be sure that the assets that the United States has are in places that we need. That means to deal less with the Middle East. That means he spoke of ending the Afghanistan war and bringing the troops back home, and we expect to see more reduction in military footprint in the Middle East. Not totally, but less from what we saw in the past. And the main point will be Asia, the Indo-Pacific arena, to protect allies, to show China our policy towards Taiwan, and strengthen American forces in Asia in order to prepare new tools, cyber tools and others, to challenge Russia and China. And third, it's to strengthen the United States at home. All the initiatives that Yuna spoke about, financial and with infrastructure and social justice and racial issues, education, social cohesion, and other societal issues, Biden sees in these initiatives solutions that are very powerful for the United States facing other forces. It strengthens the United States and other allies of the United States to stand shoulder to shoulder with the United States facing rivals. Thank you very much, Don. From here, we will go more to the Middle East. We will go now to Eldad Shavit, from the Mossad, but today a senior researcher in INSS and leads the program that deals with Israel-US relations. It took Biden quite some time to speak to regional leaders here, and he stopped the support with the Yemen war, and probably this region is not the top priority of Biden. But still, how do you perceive his policy? With what has been said by the previous speakers, the Middle East is certainly not in the main priority of Biden. This you can see by what he plans to invest, and the senior leadership in the United States, the attention that they give. In practice, when we look at what Biden himself said and other governmental seniors before the elections, their tweets, their declarations, the administration is realizing in practice what they promised during the campaign relating to the Middle East. In general, just like the predecessors of Biden, if it's Obama and even Trump, the agenda is to reduce as much as possible the footprint and presence in the Middle East, and this is expressed also with military resources, but other resources, financial and policy issues. Also, the decision that was mentioned here to extract all the forces from Afghanistan up until 9/11. This is contrary to what the senior leaders of the military thought, and this demonstrates this. The question is if there will be a follow-up with other forces in the Gulf, and a question that there's no answer. Will this reflect to Gulf states? In the past, presence in Gulf states was a staging point to Afghanistan. But if there are no forces in Afghanistan, maybe we don't need so many forces in the Gulf. Also, other tools in the foreign policy of the Biden administration, cooperations, diplomacy, discourse, we all see this in the way that they implement their policy in the Middle East. In general, I think the Biden administration, unlike previous administrations, has a different set of values. For instance, in their agenda, you see more human rights. But Biden is also a senior politician. He knows the Middle East. He knows the Middle East. He expressed realpolitik. So he will bring together also the wish to have a new agenda, but also the understanding that the Middle East is the Middle East, and you have to relate to it accordingly. We also saw that the Middle East poses surprises and will require Biden maybe to do acts that he did not plan to do. For instance, the decision to act against targets of military militias on the Iraq-Syrian border. These were solutions against threats that emerged, targets that were attacking Americans in Iraq. And this was also a message that, yes, I'm coming with a different approach, but if needed, I will do what needs to be done. We should say, before touching the issues themselves, that he understands, the administration understands that the Middle East is a place that changed. And he understands that these issues have to be addressed. For instance, the issue of the Abraham Accord, the decision to move the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And I think these issues, I don't think is going to change. They also decided to leave the deal of the F-35s to UAE because they understand that this serves American interests. So realigning the policy also takes into account the facts on the ground and things that happened. As far as the central issues that the administration is dealing with, first and foremost, is Iran. I think that what they do with Iran, what's going to happen with Iran, will reflect on the entire policy in the Middle East, and this will be very significant for how we will find this administration in the next years in the region. Throughout the Biden campaign, he clearly spoke of his wish to go back to the nuclear deal with Iran and reduce the sanctions from Iran if Iran abides to the deal. The administration also promised that returning to the deal will serve as a platform to have a longer and stronger deal. After a time of uncertainty, it seems that the talks now between the United States and Iran, these are happening through a third party, through the Europeans. It seems that they are reaching some kind of agreement. The path is still far and success is not promised. Bad reception. Both countries want to return to the deal, it seems. And this is what their policy that they're trying to implement. And to achieve this goal, it could be that the Americans will flex their prerequisite or their declaration that Iran has to first go back to the deal and only then will they return. Maybe they will be more flexible with this policy issue. I think that what they're trying to do now is find a synchronization between both countries so it will be clear that each one of them will have what to gain. It seems like they want to go full force back and not do intermediate steps, so they will both know what the end game will be for these talks. Probably in the talks that are happening now, the issue of a stronger and longer deal will not be raised, because if it will be raised, the Iranians will probably object. In this issue, although the Americans are talking about a longer and stronger deal, it's not clear if they have a work plan of how to do such a thing. How do they plan to implement this goal that will bring the Iranians to the negotiation table to talk about something else? They said that maybe they will use the threat that they have of sanctions, but I think that it's too early to predict. I think that those that are concerned, and this is right, when the Americans have on their plate so many problems that Iran will go back to the deal, and after the sanctions are dropped, the timeline for enrichment will again go back to what it was when they put Iran back in the box, like the genie back in the box. Maybe this will reduce the motivation to go to this longer and stronger deal. I think it's early, but this is a possibility that Israel should also take into account when doing our policy towards the Americans. This is about Iran. As far as the Saudis, I think that here too, there is a full realization of the obligations of Biden. He certainly related very strongly to Saudi Arabia before the elections. He spoke about the assassination of Khashoggi, and he said this is something that was to be answered. After he was inaugurated, he published the unclassified report that certainly pointed a blaming finger at the Saudis, especially Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, and also talking about sanctions. But here too, I think these issues are complex because on the one hand, the United States wants to have a different policy towards Saudi Arabia from what Trump had, much more practical and not personal. But on the other hand, America understands that Saudi Arabia is a country that's important, that the relationship, strategic relationship, are very important, and they said this and they're doing it. So they're also promising to support this, the stability. We will stop here, Eldad. Okay, we'll get to the other issues in the next round. It's a good time, I think, to go to speak about the Iranian side of this dialogue. Thank you for now. We will now go to Sima Shine. She's also ex-intelligence senior officer and also from the Strategic Affairs Office. And today she deals, or she heads, the research group on Iran in INSS. We heard Eldad speak about the American side, but in general, how does the new administration look from the Iranian angle? It looked in Trump's last year that maybe the Iranians are restraining themselves. Is this new administration now maybe making them more aggressive? And following what was said until now, are we going back to the deal from 2015? And if yes, is there a chance for a, as described here, stronger and longer? Yes, your questions are very important. I can't answer them all. I certainly want to say that the big and first difference between the way they deal with Trump and Biden is the willingness to come to negotiation. Trump, day in and day out, offered the Iranians to meet. He said, you will have the best deal with me. I'm a businessman. He didn't know how to lure them. But the Iranians decided that they cannot do business with him. Even though we had the maximum pressure policy, they didn't cave in. Biden is perceived as the opposite. The Iranians don't believe the Americans, period. This is the basic concept. But there are nuances. Biden that said this before the elections, and after he was elected, I'm willing to come and talk. The Iranians, after they tried to give conditions that were impossible for the Americans, also under European pressure, and Russian and Chinese, all, maybe this is one of the only circumstances where I can say that everyone wants to go back to the previous deal. The Europeans, the Russians, the Chinese, and the Americans and the Iranians. So, after the Europeans' intervention, mainly the Europeans, both sides agreed to come to Vienna to the talks, not direct talks. There are intermediates here, but there are agreements and moving forward. And the sides today, what they're doing with two work groups, one about sanctions and one about nuclear issues, they are defining, writing a paper on what should be the end game. What are the steps that Iran has to do as far as the nuclear deal, and going back to the JCPOA from 2015, and what the United States must do as far as sanctions in order to reach the same point. We must say that the issue of sanctions is a little more complex and sensitive because the Iranians asked that the Americans not only go back to all the sanctions that were taken off at 2015, but also take off the Trump sanctions from 2017. And why? Because the Trump administration, in trying to prevent a future administration to go back, they tied in some of the sanctions to terror. So it's more difficult today to take these sanctions off. But I think that Trump, the Biden administration understands this trick that Trump tried to do. So we will see a middle ground move. Some of the sanctions, I think, even those the ones that were attached, like the Central Bank of Iran. It's clear that you take the sanctions away from the banking system. The central bank is very important. Even though it was attached to terror, I assume that the Biden administration will lift the sanctions. Clearly, the Iranians won't get everything they want, but also the Biden administration will have to be flexible. It seems right now that the sides have advanced. There are reports from the Iranian side and the American side that there is advancement, but as Eldad said, it is not clear. At the end, they will argue on the little issues. Will this sanction be lifted? Will that sanction be lifted? How will it be done? For instance, as far as technology, Iran has advanced centrifuges. Will Iran remove them all? Will Iran destroy them? As the reports came in that the American administration asked not only that they are stored, but actually dismantled and destroyed. It's not clear, but I think the sides have passed the point of no return, and they're going towards an agreed upon paper that both sides will bring them back to the table, or bring back to an agreement. Before the elections in Iran? I don't have an answer for this question. I think that probably yes, there's a good chance that yes. I assume that if Khamenei agreed to move forward for the talks in Vienna, this means it's not important for him if it happens in the time of Rouhani or not. Maybe even they would rather, even those that publicly oppose, maybe they want to put this file on Rouhani that's not going to be elected again, and the next president coming in will be free from direct involvement with the Americans and continue the way as it is. The Iranians won't speak to the Americans about anything else that is not nuclear, not regional, not Iraq, not Syria, nothing. So maybe it will be easier for the next administration to do this. But I don't know, as I said. I assume that both sides are trying to rush to reach it before. The other question is, you ask, are the Americans willing? How are they managing this? something that was not said, the team that Biden has. Biden's team is constructed of people that know the Iranian issue very well. Some of them were directly involved with writing the nitty-gritty of the previous deal. I'll remind you, for instance, Richard Nephew, that dealt with all the sanctions on Iran, and he was a key point there. Today he is the deputy of the special envoy for Iran. So he's really a central figure that can really manage the issue of lifting the sanctions, because he knows how done, what requires Congress, what can be a presidential decision. Unlike the past, when the Iranian team was all a team that moved on for many years, here too on the American side, we don't have new people that don't know what they're talking about. It's people that know everything. They know the tricks, they know the details. So they are more equal. So on the backdrop of this, the team here has a heritage, like from 2015, that really will try to bring about a longer and stronger deal, you think? Here we should make it very clear. What they're talking about now is returning to the previous deal. There's no other choice. This team is saying, and Biden himself has been saying this, longer and stronger. This means after we return to the deal, we will prove the goodwill and our intentions, both sides, not only the Americans. We will talk about something else in addition. There are many questions here in Israel and in other places. Is there a motivation for Iran after lifting the sanctions? And I want to remind you, not all the sanctions, only those relating to nuclear issues. Will they have a motivation to go to another new deal? The Americans think so. They think yes. I want to remind you that if they do go to such a negotiation, not only the Americans will have demands, also the Iranians will have demands. So there are many things that the Iranians can demand from the Americans if they go to an improved agreement. The Americans say that if the Iranians will not be willing, the Americans always fall back to sanctions, and they prove that they can do it. I think it will be much more difficult, less likely to happen. So we will see what the motivation will be, and if this administration will be able to put a good motivation on the table so they will come to the next agreement. It's an open question. In current Israel, there is skepticism. I also think it's difficult, but it's not impossible. Maybe one word about Israel. If I mentioned the doubts in Israel, I want to say that in Israel we see a change in the way Israel relates to the United States. It's not the same as in the time of Obama in 2015. On the one hand, Israel, official Israel, makes it clear that we oppose returning to the deal. We think it's a bad idea, but there's not a campaign or not going to war with America. Everyone understands this. The explanation is very simple. You can't start a 4-year administration of Biden with a direct, heated confrontation. So Israel understands that we need to express our view, but not doing it in a strong opposition and fighting on the next phase, which will be the next deal. And the last sentence I want to say, there is nuclear issues, but for Israel there is all the other issues, the problematic actions of Iran in the region. I hope Israel is able to reach agreements or understandings with the United States, and that's relating to all the regional issues and the backing that the United States gives to Israel in protecting Israel's interests. It's a good opportunity. Eldad spoke about the Gulf, and from Abu Dhabi, we're joined by Dr. Ibtisam El-Khatmi, a long-time participant here, very welcome. Biden spoke, no doubt, in a very positive way about normalization, but he froze for several months the weapons deal to UAE. He promised to speak to Saudi Arabia about the Iranian issue, but is very critical about human rights in Saudi Arabia. He talked supporting the Yemen war. How does this administration seem like from the Gulf? How does this change in policy relate to the normalization with Israel? Can it reflect on the normalization? And how much is it reflecting on the Gulf states?
Thank you, Itai, and it's always a pleasure to participate in INSS event. Well, Itai, GCC countries have realized that the US under the Biden administration is striving hard to increase and expand its competitive advantage in global leadership and international influence. So I speak about UAE based on its alliance with US is working to enhance the Emirati American and also GCC American interests through exert more effort to de-escalate conflicts, support diplomatic solution in Yemen and Libya, and support a track of pacification in the whole region and avoid military solution. Second, empower the Abraham Accords and cement fields of cooperation with Israel. This is in turn would expand the prospect of the Abraham Accords to be a genuine strategic shift in Middle East that reformulates regional partnership, faces common regional challenges, attempts to enhance moderation and prosperity in the region. So based on the two previous points, GCC countries would be more willing to shoulder more responsibility in preserving their security and regional security, the active participation in the security, militarily, and political burden sharing, and increase deterrence capability to face threats and challenges in a responsible and wise ways, and a commitment derived from lesson learned in the Yemeni and Libyan war. So in this context comes the Biden administration decision to move ahead with the sale of the F-35 fighters to the UAE, and furthermore, the decision to move Israel from US European Command's responsibility to US Central Commands is in the best interest of institutionalizing the strategic cooperation between GCC and Israel. So the Abraham Accord have helped in speeding up this decision, which has been under discussion for years. So I don't think that Biden administration will act against that. In fact, this is if American looking for more or lowering their finger print in the region. So this will help, the Abraham Accord will help their goal in bringing more stability and security in the region. But the ongoing geopolitical shifts in the Middle East and the strategic breakthrough made by Abraham Accord have also made the Gulf security inseparable from the security of both the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. So the fact that GCC countries share interest with multiple parties plays a positive role in supporting efforts to reach a just compromise and mutually acceptable solution between Egypt, Ethiopia, Sudan, and Great Renaissance Dam. So this surely will prevent the parties to the conflict from restoring to military option and resolving this issue. And this is what Biden administration wants to. So GCC countries are fully aware that while the US seeks to protect its influence in the Middle East, it wishes to reduce its military presence in the region. So they are also aware of the priority of the Chinese and Russian threats in the US national security strategy, therefore redefining and consolidating the US-GCC relation within a new regional and global context This requires the establishment of dynamic institutional mechanism to ensure serious and practical coordination and consultation with the US side. This will help limit surprise decision and shift in the regional landscape, particularly in the Iran's fight. Now, coming to Saudi, I think Biden administration, they've been mistaken in just accusing MBS because they will need Saudi. In any way, they will need Saudi. Now, if they want to convince Saudi to come to join Abraham Accords, so they have to lower their pressure on Saudi. They have, because the Saudi will not join the Abraham Accords if they feel the heat and always the human rights issue is there. Because I'm always telling the American, with the Chinese, with the Russian, they come without any conditions putting. But you Americans, so they come easily and easily to the region. And if you want to challenge the Chinese in the region, you cannot put that condition. It's easy for the GCC to deal with Russia and China rather than you. But your interest is always here, and you cannot. And even if you want to move, your interest will be in the Middle East.
Ibtisam, it's very interesting what you said about Saudi Arabia and American pressure. If the Americans will reduce the pressure from MBS from Saudi Arabia, they will join the Abraham Accords?
This will make it easy for them, Itai. I mean, under this pressure and pressure from inside, give incentive. I think this is my view. At least you give incentive for Saudi. Okay, at least make this as an incentive. And I think they have that willingness to join Abraham Accord.
Another question, the American policy that's more appeasing, more that negotiates with Iran. Does this trouble the Gulf states? For instance, UAE? Could it turn the Iranians into more aggressive in this region?
Well, look, GCC countries apparently support Biden's step in making more diplomatic efforts toward resolving Iran crisis. And they expect that the new administration, while doing so, will draw lessons from the experience of 2015 and their deal with Tehran. In other words, Washington should establish strict standards and controls in any future deal to ensure that Tehran will not be able to acquire a nuclear weapon. This agreement should also include provisions that address the threats of Iran arsenal of ballistic missiles and Tehran malign activities in the region. For their part, GCC countries are willing to take steps in building confidence with Iran at various levels. The future nuclear deal should meet the interests of all stakeholders in the region and address their security concern. And I think this deal will eventually serve as a cornerstone of collective security structure that can enhance regional security, resolve differences peacefully, and protect international maritime waterways to ensure the smooth of the oil supplies and safe shipping. I won't say they are, okay, now this negotiation in Vienna, they were looking that they will take a part in that. I'm talking about GCC, and they're upset that the American, they blocked that channel. Maybe that which pushed Saudi to have that talk with the Iranian and Iraq, although the both sides, they denied that talk. So consultation, we heard from Blinken, We heard from Jack Sullivan, but still until now, no consultation with GCC regarding the Iranian file.
Thank you very much, Iftisam. And back to Israel. Brigadier General Reserve Udi Dekel, Managing Director of INSS. We hear and we understand that this is a totally different administration with a different policy. Does Israel understand this change happening in the United States? Is Israel responding appropriately? And what should be Israeli policy relating to what we heard about the Iranians, the other issues? Hello, everybody. I hope my internet will work. I have a lot of problems here. The truth is that Israel is slowly realizing that things have changed. It takes time, but Israel understands. There's a pressure now not to bother the negotiations with Iran. I want to begin by saying things that have always already been said, that Israel should take into account the main points in dealing with the Biden administration after 100 days. This administration understands that the American hegemony in the region did not bring anything good, did not bring stability, didn't solve any problem. 20 years they're in this quagmire. They don't know how to get out of this mud. Some of the countries are relying too much on the United States. They think that only Israel, from all their allies, they believe that only Israel can defend itself. Unlike the other countries, it has been said a lot, the Middle East is not in priority. The focus is on other issues. Yuna spoke about at home. We talk about China. The multilateral issues here are relevant. Two things that are very significant here: understanding the limits of power. You don't solve problems with problems, but with diplomacy. And the second thing is that we should have restraint, the restraint policy. We heard yesterday J Street leaders, progressive leaders, speaking in a conference there. And from this, Israel should know how to manage itself appropriately. Iftisam spoke very nice about the Abraham Accords. By the way, the only accords that this administration said that they're willing to adopt from the achievements of the previous administration of Trump. But in the meantime, actions don't show it. We heard that there's no discourse. They held the weapons deployments. We also lost a special, we thought always the path to Washington goes through Jerusalem. Not anymore. They don't need us to solve problems with the administration because we have our own problems with the administration. This administration is not determined to activate force. I said this already. And they actually cancel the military option towards Iran. And you can't have negotiations with Iran without an Iranian understanding that there is a possibility of attacking them. Problems that the Americans have here, maybe with Iran-Syria border, but nothing much more dramatic than that. A proof that the Americans are trying to reduce their footprint. If you don't plan to exercise force, then you're not taken seriously in the Middle East. And Israel also got a notice from the United States, stop bothering us and be much more careful. What bothers us, one thing that concerns us, is that this process of leaving Afghanistan will continue to Iraq and then to East Syria. East Syria is a strategic point for Israel because it's the last point that is trying to close the Iranian bridge, the land bridge, all the way to the Mediterranean. Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. And the second that's also important, not less important, that doesn't give the pro-Assad coalition, Assad, Iranians, and Russia to take over strategic places. By the way, minimal American investment, and has great benefits because it doesn't let the problematic factors to take over this region that is also strategic and also is full of resources. It's very important that Israel knows to convince the administration not to do this because it will change the Middle East. It will enable Iran the possibility to broaden its influence. Another thing happened that I think people don't understand enough. In fact, the regional issues connects to the nuclear issues. It wasn't clear enough in the debate here. If in the past people thought you can separate, no, you can't separate regional issues and nuclear issues. The discourse on the Iranian regional actions and their subversive actions and all that, you can't detach that from nuclear. Udi, why can't it be detached? Iran doesn't want to attach it, and I think the Americans don't want to attach. But it's attached, it's connected, it's always there. If the United States that doesn't respond for the regional thing with force, this influences also perception that they won't exercise force when it comes to nuclear issues. The coalition that was supposed to be with the United States, when they see that the United States does nothing in the regional issue and they run to speak to Iran, so also they will run to talk to Iran. Why? Because if there's no choice, it's best to talk in Iran. We can't separate anymore. It's a technical separation, and practice, it is connected, it is related. Israel has to stabilize, and I know there's a dialogue that's very intimate that has to do with the Iranians. How to stop the Iranian regional influence. For Israel, of course, these issues are both very important. There's a part that has to do with Russia. If in the previous administration there was a sense, and there were even actions in this direction, the triangle American, Russia, Israel, things could have been coordinated. This administration, Russia for them is in a much more problematic situation than the Trump administration. So the attempt to reach agreements with Russia as far as Syria, this is not relevant now. And we have to take also this into consideration. And also our relations with Russia, if we look, they're viewed differently in Washington. The operational coordination that turned into strategic coordination influences the relationship. What is the arena that Israel should be also very careful? The Palestinian arena. As Dan Shapiro said and others, this administration doesn't want to be involved in the Palestinian issue. It's probably in their 77th priority list. Now the issues of the election came in. It's a feeling like it's a thorn in an unpleasant place for the Americans. But it's very important for Israel not to do moves that the U.S. administration will see this as something challenging for the American administration, or that Israel does something unilaterally in the Palestinian arena. It's important for the Biden administration that the two-state solution will be the relevant goal, that Israel should stop doing things that, just like speaking of, like the previous administration of Netanyahu, of adding parts of the Judea and Samaria, we should not challenge them. We have to be very sensitive and very careful towards the Palestinian arena so as not to bring the Americans to come into something that they don't want to enter. The last thing that I want to say that troubles me recently, it's the situation in Jordan that no one's talking about. Instability in Jordan that has been expressed recently with the king dealing with his half-brother. We have to remember that in Jordan, there are many American bases, and destabilization of Jordan will influence America dramatically in the region. It also influences us. Strengthening the kingdom of Jordan should be a joint goal of the United States and Israel, and we have a combined interest, and we have to really work on how to strengthen the kingdom and stabilize it. It's a central key or link in the chain of regional stability. Bottom line, what do I say? We have to understand that this administration is different. It looks at us differently. It judges our actions differently. We no longer have this green card to do whatever we want. We have to consult on everything, update on everything, and take into consideration the American interests in order not to bring ourselves into friction with the Americans. Thank you very much, Udi. We have a few more questions from the audience. If some will be addressed at you, towards Eldad and Dan Shapiro. Yuna, a few comments you wanted to give towards the conclusion? First, I really want to say about the connection between the Biden administration and what happens in Israel, it's amazing to see, and this has been brought up, the different approach, even now. Every issue that happens now that is attributed to Israel and Natanz, I think in the past, it would have there would have been a war of briefers in the background. For me, it was very hard to find any comment or brief, and I think this reflects something about the way that the relationship has advanced. There's an opportunity here. Everyone's talking about strategic issues, talking about regional issues, Iranian issues. Really, we should notice the public opinion in the United States. It changes a lot, and especially with the Biden administration, there's an opportunity to improve this. I don't remember who it was, but one of the poll companies did their yearly poll, and a few weeks ago they spoke about this, of how the Democratic Party sees Israel. The question was, how do they see Israel? Or should Israel exert, or should the United States exert more pressure on Israel? And you see the difference. More than 50%, 53% think that yes, the United States should pressure Israel. But it's not only the number, it's the whole trend reflected. We see that it took 10 years for this figure to go up from 33 to 43%, and then it took only 3 years to do the leap from 43% to 53%. Public opinion is changing. Of course, there's what happened with Trump and everything that happened there, this increased processes with identifying Netanyahu and Trump, seeing them as very aligned. But there's an opportunity now that we should grasp. So especially when dealing with Iran, the region, Palestine, it is all related. It's a critical point. And we're in the last moments of this bipartisan support for Israel that must remain. I think in Israel we understand this very well. In the past, the president went and spoke to both houses to a joint session against the nuclear deal. He understood the implication, but still he decided to do this opposing the American president because he thought there was a greater goal. I think that today there is an understanding that things have changed and maybe it has to be more delicate. There is an attempt now from the Biden administration to emphasize how they are committed to the security interest of Israel, to the relationship with Israel, even when it's not easy, even when it's not simple, but they keep emphasizing the relationship. And Israel should grasp this opportunity now and in the future. Thank you, Yuna. And now to a few questions that we received from our viewers. Ivtisam, a question from someone. What will be the Saudi policy if the United States and the powers go back to the nuclear deal? How would Saudi Arabia respond? What will the Saudi policy be to going back to the deal with Iran?
Well, you know, the problem with the Gulf is that they don't share the same vision towards Iran and the threats. And this has weakened their position, okay? And going each one by one to Iran, this has weakened the position. I don't think, like last deal, what did the Saudi do? They don't have something in their hands. What they did this time, they went direct to talk to the Iranian and Iraq. I think this is weakened the position of everybody because there should be a regional initiative for approaching Iran, putting at least, if there is Iran always calling for regional dialogue, Iran, I won't agree here what Odi said. The Iranian always tend to separate the issues, that the nuclear deal is something and the ballistic missile something and the regional activities something else. So there should be, and should be Israel also interest represented in that regional initiative, that we sit on the table, we talk to the Iranian about the ballistic missiles, the malign activities, Although, and the Americans should be the guarantor, and the UN should be guarantor for that regional dialogue. In this case, otherwise, if you go one by one, it is weak in your position. Now, if the Saudi wants the Iranian to stop the Houthis, why I would stop something? I have something. I have card vis-a-vis what? It will depend what Saudi will offer. Okay, the Iranian always wants that economic cooperation. Okay, if you are giving them this with only this card, the Houthis card, I don't think we will reach a stable region.
Thank you, Iftisam. Now addressing Dan Shapiro, and then more questions, and you decide who will answer. We are asked by the audience about Biden's relation to territorial demands of Turkey in the Mediterranean and how this will influencing Israel. Another question relates to Biden's plan to extract the forces from the Middle East. Will the president, in fact, take out more forces than he already declared? And more questions relate to Saudi Arabia. Will the relationship get worse, if you think? And more relating to Israel, what will be the policy towards Israeli construction beyond the Green Line in Judea and Samaria? Okay, so Eldad, and then we will wrap up. I don't see a Biden approach to totally take out forces from the Middle East. When he took office, I think there were about 40,000 troops and presence of the American fleet in the Gulf, even without relating to other military assistance. In the broader assistance to Israel, Jordan, Egypt. So we can't imagine, I don't think we can, that all these forces will disappear. But certainly there's a wish not to add to these forces. Certainly there will be a willingness to any scenario that could happen in Asia or Europe facing China and Russia. All the partners of the United States in the region have to get used to the fact that there's less, but not zero, of American presence. I will relate to construction in the territories beyond the Green Line, and maybe pass it on to Eldad. Biden said during his election campaign that he objects to unilateral acts from the Israeli side and the Palestinian side. And he said also construction in settlements. He doesn't see a direct or immediate opportunity to reach the two-state solution or even bring the two sides back to the negotiation table. But he wants to preserve the possibility to reach a two-state solution in the future. So he will align the American policy and other regional powers, Israelis, Palestinians, and other countries, including the countries that are normalizing relations with Israel, that all should contribute to preserving the two-state solution as a realistic possibility in the future. Thank you, Eldad. I think the Biden administration will do the maximum it can to reduce its military involvement in the Middle East. I think they want two things. One is to use the soft diplomatic tools to reach their goals, and second, they assume that the countries in the Middle East have the tools and the the power, the ability to deal with threats with their capabilities, and they don't need the Americans. Again, this doesn't mean that if the administration will feel that there's a threat that they need to deal with, of course they have their military tools that are not in the Middle East. They can use them, they can deploy them. Also today, they have a minimum amount of force in Iraq. And also here with a strategic dialogue with Iraq, the forces are slowly reducing. There's a topic we didn't touch upon, and that is the relationship with Turkey. Certainly there is a change, no doubt. We said that Biden spoke with leaders in the region. With Erdogan, he did not speak yet. And I'm not sure that he will speak to him in the near future, because the United States sees the Turkish actions as negative in the Middle East. And they certainly, the United States is trying to maneuver between the fact that Turkey is an ally because it is a member of NATO and the problems that Biden has with Turkey's actions. To summarize about Israel, there's a feeling here that people are optimistic about Israel-US relations. I want to point on my fear that we are facing a deterioration or problematic relations between Israel and the United States, because I think in Israel there's not a good realization that there's an administration that really means to do with Iran what they say that they're going to do. And I still am not sure that we understand the ramifications of what happens in Natan. The American Defense Secretary was here, and this all reflects on how Biden will relate to Israel, because we still remember, he still remembers how Israel acted in the past. So there's a long path to take, even if we are talking. Seema, your final remarks? I want only to point on one point that was raised. I think that Iftisam touched upon this, and I want to echo this and also add to the Israeli side. We don't know yet. There are rumors in the Financial Times and others about a dialogue that is supposedly happening in Iraq between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And there was the issue of United States and Saudi relations. I think the Abraham Accord, all of this together, I want to tie in together and say that as far as Israel is concerned, it's certainly clear that this move, if this will come to fruition, of Iran and the United States returning to the deal, changes the balance of power in the region, even if not in a military balance, but as far as a feeling of the countries and the administrations and leadership. There's a wish also from the Saudi Arabia to return to talk to Iran, maybe not be friends, but reach a kind of balance. All this does not push to a dialogue with Saudi Arabia and Israel, but all in all, it gives us a feeling that what we thought that only several months ago, that here there's a front, anti-Iranian front, the United States is pushing this front and leading it, this thing I think is dissolving. And I repeat what I said many times. Israel must have good relations with the Gulf states. There are very good reasons for this. The Iranian threat is not the main reason. There are many other reasons. As far as the Iranian threat, we can't rely on these countries because they have other interests facing Iran and the United States. Thank you, Seema. We will conclude with Major General Amos Yadlin, Reserve. Amos, I think this is probably the last conference that you are concluding as the head of INSS. Another opportunity to thank you for the heights that you brought INSS and your leadership, and no one is more appropriate than you to conclude this conference. Good evening to all the viewers at home. Thank you to everyone that spoke and the presenters and speakers, and certainly there's a lot to discuss. We're talking about the strongest and most important ally that Israel has, and sometimes the only ally that Israel has. Sometimes the question of who the president is, it's not less important from who's going to be a prime minister in Israel. In the United States, they're able to decide it once every 4 years. We have a rougher time deciding who our leader will be. I think the position of the United States president, or the policy that he has facing Israel, is a very important component in Israel's national security. We see a president that was called by Trump Sleepy Joe, but he is certainly not so. He defines very substantial goals, great reforms in internal affairs. The coronavirus issues, the racial rifts pushed him to put a vision and state a goal, and he has a plan that we see it in the first 100 days of his administration, also in its characteristics ideologically, but also in the policy that he wants to implement. He already began to implement in the first 100 days of its administration, and it's the right thing to do. We see his foreign policy. The fact that there are internal problems in the United States does not bother this president to try to renew alliances with allies, ideological allies in the world, and don't bother in his wish to reconstruct or maintain the United States' position as a leader in the world, militarily, financially, and politically. Here he has bitter rivals. He began with these moves, and I think internally and externally, it's too early to judge his success, but no doubt where he is headed. I think that this administration also brings with it a return to traditional policy of constructing policy, presenting the policy to debate internally, bottom up, after receiving the directive from the president, top down, public debate, and normalcy, if you will, in decision-making process in the United States, and maybe a calmer situation from the mayhem that reflected the previous administration. When we view things from Jerusalem, no doubt we have to ask, who is Jerusalem? We have a government that is a transitional government for 2 years, or an intermediate, quite paralyzed government, in fact. No doubt that the Prime Minister in Israel for the last 12 years saw changes that he did not like in Washington. The previous administration gave him support to promote any interest that Netanyahu wanted. Anything he thought was good for Israel was promoted. Some were agreed upon by most Israeli parties, like Jerusalem and Iran, and most Israelis believe that Trump was right. Trump's peace plan לא שמעת תרגום? The Gulf states in Sudan and Morocco, and altogether a situation where Israel, it was very easy, and with the Trump administration, but things have changed. So the easy days of Trump for Netanyahu have gone. We were always on the same page, but no more. There's a great concern in Jerusalem from Biden, administration. In the previous conference, I said that there is a great continuation, much more than people think, in the US policy towards the Middle East. Republicans and Democrats want to end the wars in the Middle East. Trump and Biden both want the same thing. The United States sees China as the main arena and not the Middle East. They are not reliant on energy anymore. It doesn't matter if you're a Republican or Democrat. And from the Israeli angle, both Republicans and Democrats don't want to see a nuclear Iran, and they want to promote peace and normalization. And both are committed to the security of Israel. So in the fundamentals of foreign policy of the United States, we have nothing to worry about. But if we go up one floor, one step, there are differences in view how to reach it. What is the security of Israel? Are the territories that we hold from 67, do they support Israel's security or not? Will Iran have a bomb or not? Will we achieve this diplomatically or in the other way? Controversies are how to reach the common goals. And I think that this is very clear in what is now on the agenda. If the president didn't want to deal with the Middle East, he had COVID, he had health issues, he had racial issues, he had China and a technological challenge, and China, military China economy, a great power competition here, and Russia is a challenge, North Korea. What the Iranians were able to do is to force him to deal with the Middle East and the Iranian issue. And this is by moving forward in the nuclear issue. Sometimes I equate this that the maximum pressure there was from west to east, from Pompeo to Iran, turned now to maximum pressure from Tehran towards west. It begins from advancement in the nuclear program. It continues with attacking American bases in Iraq, almost weekly attacks on Saudi Arabia by the Houthis, attacking Israeli ships. The nuclear issue is what brought the Americans closer to Vienna in dealing with an issue that maybe they would rather to postpone, like they postpone other issues in the Middle East. The Biden administration is trying to close a tension from what they promised during the elections to go back to the JCPOA and go back to the diplomatic track, with his professional understanding that this deal is very problematic. It has big holes or gaps that must be amended. Longer and stronger, this term represents, it wasn't invented in Jerusalem, it was presented by Secretary of State. It represents the other side of what the Americans want to achieve. The real problem they have is that if they go back to the JCPOA, they lose their leverage, and the thought that they will be able to activate the leverage the way Trump did seems, I think, a bit distanced from reality, but we will see what the future brings. As far as Jerusalem, there is also a dilemma. Should we go back and relate to a democratic president as Prime Minister Netanyahu related to previous President Obama in 2015? This is not easy. No one will invite him to the Congress. The military option for Israel that was very substantial in the beginning of the previous decade. Today we have to crystallize it and renew it. This will take time. So I recommend to the government of Israel, the previous or the current and future, to take a different path, a path of dialogue with the U.S. Democrat administration, where both leaders declare on their combined goal that Iran will not possess nuclear abilities and not even be on the threshold that will enable them a breakthrough to nuclear weapons. And under this framework, this public framework, and I want to remind you that Israel is not part of the deal, not part of the JCPOA if they return to it, to do a parallel agreement, reach a parallel American-Israeli agreement. We had this in the 80s when there was strategic cooperation that was signed between President Reagan and Prime Minister Shamir. Under this strategic umbrella, there were other agreements that dealt with various arenas. We should reach with the Americans an agreement on a common intelligence picture, a strategy that both countries will take if the Iranians don't go back to the deal, if they continue to advance, or if returning to the deal, but the deal will not be improved, not the longer and stronger option. What will America and Israel do to prevent Iran from reaching this point where we said that they should not reach? This would be a better policy. It is difficult for both sides. I will finish with this, the interests, the values, and the faith and trust. This is the basis for a relationship of Israel and the United States. And there is an erosion in all these three pillars of the relationship between the countries. not always in the United States. Everyone thinks that the values that in the past were very aligned, that are not a bit more distant. Interests are different. I talked about where the United States is the main problems today, with China and not the Middle East. And there is a deficit here in the trust between the current Prime Minister in Israel and the Democratic administration. We must hope that whoever the Prime Minister in Israel is, maybe it will be easier to have trust or more difficult to have trust, but for this goal of the security of Israel that both countries believe in, that we will be able to go back to good, stable relationship and dialogue that is professional and aligned and mutual plans facing the common challenges that we want to achieve. We understand today very well where the administration is after 100 days. We wish this administration much success in their overall goals and hope that the strategy will be such that will achieve these goals and not fail. Thank you and good evening. Thank you, Amos. Thank you for these final remarks and leading and your leadership, and even finished on time so Iftisam can go and break the fast. So thank you for all the participants, and goodbye from Tel Aviv.